in what we're doing. And I gave a shout out to you, Jenny, for the business case evaluation form that we borrowed, or that you guys provided, and that we used to help build our business case evaluation form. So so that was good to highlight how we're able to share things across our utilities through this effort.
Okay, so give me just a second.
Sure. We got Duncan joining us. Good morning, Duncan.
Good morning, Dan. How are you?
I'm good.
Okay, Dan, I'm ready whenever you are.
Okay.
So
I would say, yeah, it looks like we're already recording. So yeah, just again, welcome everybody. Today's topic is on the business process modeling, process assessment tools that Cello has been working on. Right, the whole Wise team has been working on developing assessment tools for that first step of assessing system maturity, and our area is no exception. The process improvement areas. Cello and team have been working on some tools with that. So today we're going to get an update on the development of that. We'll have an opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback. I don't think this is intended to be a formal presentation by any means. Cello has some slides pulled together, but yeah, it'll be a good opportunity for us to see where this is at, and then also provide some feedback so that as it develops further, it'll be useful really for all of us. But as I mentioned, for Deb and Brian, as they're jumping into this team and jumping into the WISE program, having some guidance or some tools to be able to ask us and answer some questions about where is it we want to focus our energies, like where are those pain points, and are we in a position to be able to, number one, develop the business process models, and then once we do that, are we in a spot where we can then implement change? So I hope I gave a good introduction, Cello. I'm kind of speaking.
Oh, yeah.
I'm also learning kind of where we're at with this too. So correct me where I messed up, Cello. So I'll turn it over to you, and you can take over. You and Scott can kind of take over facilitating this conversation.
Thank you, and very much appreciated. And thank you for doing that thing doing your paper at the UMC. I heard good things about it as well. I couldn't make it, but so. This is basically on the left side is kind of the people process technology framework that we have been working with, which are how value is generated in an organization when people execute processes that may be enabled by technology. Then we also have a part where we monitor performance and then feedback that to change management to adjust things based on the mission and the goals of the organization. So that's one part, is the value generation on the left side. On the right side are the steps, the 6 steps for business process maturity. And it is what we're going to talk about today is this first step of assessing system maturity. Oops. I'm not sure why my screen looks like this, but let's try the next slide. Okay. So we have these 6 themes, but essentially 4 areas. We have business process improvement, which is this team involved, team CIP, also asset management and energy. And then we have on the left side, a people side that includes workforce organization. Then we have team for change management, and also in the lower right corner, technology improvements, which is looking at technology and analytics. So this is our scope of work for this year, and it's all done collaboratively and with people. So when we look at improvements, when we look at assessing system maturity, which is again that first step on the left, of our improvement methodology, there may be, we look at what are the scope and the goals of this assessment. So the first area that one of the areas that people may want to do is to look at workforce and organizational maturity and look at how are things now. So we've had a lot of work done by a team, the quote people team, who started with 400 ideas and on what different levels of maturity mean and what organizations should avoid, what they should strive for, and it was boiled down slowly to these 7 categories shown on the left: teamwork and collaboration, employee engagement, communication. So these were the categories, and then we developed a tool, a survey that would allow us to, that includes 18 questions. On this, we call this the tier 1. So this is the survey to find out what our current as is situation is. And then we also developed tools to present the results, and so that people could look at what's going on. So to show you what that presentation looks like is, I just have slides, but there's a Power BI tool that I could show interactively. If anybody's interested, I'm running my presentation today on a Mac, and Power BI doesn't run on a Mac, but I also have a PC if somebody wants to see dynamically how this works. So this tool, like I mentioned, includes 18 questions. So there are 3 questions for this category on the left: organizational strategy and performance, 3 questions for organizational values, 2 for responsibility and accountability, just 1 for reward and recognition. And you can see below communication, engagement, and teamwork, they have their own questions. In the upper right corner is that the legend. So when the survey is conducted, and it's conducted through Microsoft Forms, and then we have a Power BI extracting these results and producing this kind of a dashboard. And we have a couple of demographic questions, demographic question 1 and 2. First one, demographic question 1, the role is, from executive management to staff in the field. So if this was a live demonstration, if I clicked on manager, then all these colors, according to this legend, would change, and the results from 1 to 5 would change in these boxes, depending on which part of the organization, how they saw the maturity and how they answered these questions. So you could see differences between how, let's say, engineering and finance looked at it, or differences how, managers versus staff in the field saw the situation. And then there are
yes. Dan has his hand up.
Okay, yes.
And Cello, I think this is a quick question. So I'm curious on these maturity scales, if there are characteristics or behaviors or competencies that describe the different levels of maturity. So for instance, very low represents, what does that mean in terms of?
Yes, we started when we started working on this, the desire was to define each one of these 5 levels with more precision. But as we were getting into it, we defined basically only the extremes. What is a 1 and what is a 5? Because a lot of times these questions, vast majority of these questions were on a Likert scale that corresponds to this legend, which was like, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And they kind of reflected how people really, how people feel about, you know, like I'll show you some specific questions in the next slide. So we thought that to have sort of a sense of what 1 means and what 5 means would make sense, but we didn't try to define what you know, low, neutral, and good means, because we thought that people would just kind of it would make the answering the survey a lot more complicated, because you'd have to, with every question, you know.
And Dan,
yeah.
Dan, I also, these were statements. I mean, they're not usually questions. They're more statements that reflect a particular, you know, point that we're trying to make. And then it's the extent to which you agree with those statements as it applies to you if you're filling out the, you know, the questionnaire or participating.
Well, which is a good lead to this. For example, right now, we on that dash, we're looking at the overall dashboard, but here we have just looking at this tab for organizational strategy and performance, and there were 3 questions. And you can see question 2, for example, my own goals and targets are well defined and understood. I know how my work will be evaluated. So we had it on a scale from, you know, strongly disagree to strongly agree, and this was the breakdown of the answers. These are fake answers that I sort of generated in random just to test the dashboards and everything, so they don't come from an actual pilot or investigation. So you can see that it would be difficult to, for example, define precisely how well, you know, the goals and targets are defined and how well they're understood. So we were kind of thinking that a lot of, as opposed to the other questions in other areas, you know, like where these 5 levels can be described in more sort of numerical terms, you know, are you meeting your KPIs, you know, and stuff like that. But here it was more like how, when you disagree or agree, it was more like an emotional kind of sense that it wasn't as easy to define all 5 levels. Does
It's
that
more
make sense?
about what the 5 level would look, statements about what a 5 level would look like, really.
Yeah.
And the extent to which those apply to you. And if they don't, then it could be a problem to follow up on, right?
So is it all right if I interject for just a second?
Sure.
It's interesting, and not unlike the many assessments at Met Council that we've had, or where they just ask you a question and then you have to either strongly disagree or strongly agree, and then there's that the levels in between. Very, very similar.
Yeah, we used several before we designed this. We looked at different methods by Gallup, by the Office of Personnel Management, the federal government, and a number of others, to sort of, in some of the questions we would take, for example, from the Office of Personnel Management, the federal government, how they looked at these issues, and then we would adjust them based on what would work for, you know, water sector utilities. So most of these tools have this kind of, that we looked at, had this kind of format.
We may not want to go into too much detail, but if it kind of, what we're kind of focused on is not necessarily the whole organization, but we're focused on a particular business process or a function or a group of people. So depending on the number of participants, you may or may not want all the demographics shown because of confidentiality, but those are choices that people would have. Deb has her hand up.
Just a quick question on how is it that many, like you said, you've been modeling, and even including the ones that we've had at the council that we've taken. How is it that there's never the question or the comment, the ability to say, I don't know? Because I think people do say I'm either neutral or I strongly agree or disagree because they don't know that something's going on in their organization. And wouldn't it be better to really know what, do they know what's going on or don't they know? If you just ask them to strongly agree or disagree and anything in between, we don't find out whether they really know that there's communication going on.
That's a good point, and we actually had I don't know option on some questions, and as we went back and forth over the past 14 15 months, I can't remember why we dropped the I don't know thing, but we used to have it actually. And what I can also say is that this what we call these 18 questions is tier 1. We also have tier 2, which means that based on how people answered these questions, you would look at the one of these components. It could be employee engagement or organizational strategy that you didn't score well on, and follow up. There are tier 2 questions statements that are already prepared that we're still working on, that you would say, okay, let me find out more about this. And those questions are while this are more about what kind of improvements do you think would work.
Yeah, and Deb, I think that the way that we wound up phrasing these statements, like you can see here, like targets and key performance indicators are transparent, broadly communicated and understood throughout the organization. We are trying to get the respondents' opinion on that rather than just say, I don't know. So if they can be neutral, but if either they agree or they don't agree, they have targets or they don't have targets, et cetera. So, and then as Chella said, we have tier 2 questions. I don't know if that we have time to go into all that, but it's like, which kind of gets at what you wind up doing about these things, from the standpoint for suggestions from the respondent. But anyway, it was a good question.
So this was the people side. Now, Scott, I cannot see if somebody had your hand up.
I'll let you know. It's okay. Yeah.
So, but if the scope of improvement we want to make is not solely focused on organization and workforce, then we would, if we wanted to look at business processes and technology, then we would first select the business process. And then on that WRF 5039 project that I was also involved in, we put together a little tool to look at once the process is selected, to see, well, what are the characteristics of that business process. And so we would start by looking at different things that we do in a utility, and then the team would decide, select one process, and it could be maintaining assets, for example. So when getting to that, after selecting a process, then we would look at how mature is that specific process. So this is scalable, can then be applied to different processes. This was not work that was done on Wise, but we will just kind of use it and improve on it. So that maturity model has 2 pieces. The first is the characteristics of the process itself. Is it very complex? Is it simple? Is it something like CIP, which you have a lot of people involved and across the organization, or is it something like calibrating a flow meter? What is the impact What will happen if this doesn't go well? And how much do we know about this project? How much is documented? So that's the first thing, is the characteristics. And the second thing we want to know is the goals and performance management. Do we know what the kind of decisions we need to support? Are business goals well defined and documented? And how is performance measured? And are we using these measurements to improve how we manage things? So on this tool, I posted a PDF file that I originally prepared, where the questions that we put together would be used as a survey. So that was our initial take at it. Later on, we changed the approach a little bit, and I'll tell you about that as well. So these 5 categories here were really to figure out what kind of business process are we dealing with. So as we go through that, because of the time, I'm not going to go through all the questions that we have there, but I posted them. And so when we look at that, when we conduct this assessment and get these answers, then we can see how mature is our process. And then depending, if we don't know much about the process and it's very complicated and stuff like that, we should probably improve process documentations and define the business needs before we go forward, because there are so many examples where, for example, technology failed, where because there was business needs have not been well defined. So just to show you an example of what was in that assessment, on this question of knowledge and documentation, we asked questions like, what is included in the documentation? What do you know about this process? Do you know who all the stakeholders are? Do you know what the activities and workflows and decisions are? What are the data required for each activity, technologies and system that you need to support? Do you have the roles and responsibilities defined? Do you understand what the resources are that are required for these activities, like staff or equipment? How much time does it take to complete? Documents, materials, artifacts, data that are input for these activities, and then what is generated by the activities, and what are the metrics for tracking? Now, very rarely we have all this documentation available, and one would be, no, we don't know, and 5 would be, yeah, we have it fully described and documented, and it's periodically updated. So Dan Ott's paper at the UMC was actually was basically one of the things they were saying. It is very helpful for us to know more about these business processes. And the more complex the process, such as CIP, which is very complex, the more we need to have the documentation improved. So on the business process side, in addition to looking at maturity, which we have done a lot of work on actual system models, which is the BPMN diagrams that we've been developing for the past 5 years. And we use those to analyze the as-is state, designed to be system state, and then later for planning improvements. So if we have the documentation of the business process, then we can also look at what state is how mature is our technology? How mature are we in terms of using technology?
And Cello, Dan
yes,
has his hand up, by the way.
yes, sir. Go. Sorry.
Yeah, Cello, just that last slide prompted a question for me about the process maturity for, I think you called it scope and complexity. And I guess I'm kind of wrestling with that a little bit because I'm thinking some processes I might characterize as a simple process, but I guess I'm like wondering about the maturity. How does that fit in the maturity side of it?
Yes,
There's kind of two different ways to think about it. You might have a process that's a simple process, and then another process that's a complex process. Or another way to think about it is like when we didn't have any documentation on our CIP, we started documenting it. And when you start, you capture kind of the basics of the process, and that would be a simple documentation of that process.
Yeah.
But and as you start to gather more information and understand it more, it tends to grow in complexity because there's more involved in it. So
yes.
What are you trying to measure there with that question? Is it which one of them?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. It's part of the maturity model, but it's not actually measuring maturity. What it's there for is to assess the risk and the need to develop the documentation. Because I took those slides out. Let's say that you look at something like this and you see that you don't have much documentation and it's very complex, it means that it's more risk. So if we look at these three things, if something is really complex and it's a critical thing and you don't have documentation, then it drives up the need to document it. So the complexity itself is not a measure of maturity. The reason that it's part of the maturity model is that it helps us assess, how much trouble we can get into. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess so that helps me to understand is that this assessment tool for the process side is not really measuring maturity. It's really measuring risk. It's giving us.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. That's fair.
So the idea is that when we look at, for example, acquiring technology, that would then help us understand how much risk is there for things to go south, because without having a sense for how complex and what is the impact, helps us kind of put like you said, the risk framework around that, around the application of technology.
Cello, I would just add that while it does assess risk, it also, in the process of doing that, it identifies areas for potential improvement. When you score them 1 through 5,
yes,
and if basically that's something that you should pay attention to, then it's going to help you focus on that as an area for improvement, in your overall system and process.
Yeah, thank you. So this tool was the deliverable. Okay, this was the topic, this technology maturity assessment. There was a whole workshop on that Water Research Foundation project, Smart Utilities and Intelligent Water System, where I was a co-principal investigator. So we had a workshop dedicated to this, just to for this tool. And the deliverable to WRF was a Qualtrics survey. However, there are a lot of things useful for us as we go on Wise, but I decided that on Wise we would not use Qualtrics, because it really should not be a survey, because survey is not not an appropriate tool. I'll explain why. The maturity model for technology that was developed on that other project had 4 layers. At the bottom, this is, are we collecting the data that we're needing? Are we managing this data properly? Do we have analytics in place? And do we understand how we need to automate or support the business decisions? So these were the 4 layers. As I said, this is a whole nother project and I can only provide a summary, but instead of using Qualtrics, that's why I have that. It's not a survey. It's really a way, it should be an instrument that is used by a group of people to discuss, and that so that's why I turned it into a spreadsheet. So I have it now in a spreadsheet form that can be shared, and it really is more amenable to discussing as a group than something form that you would get in an email and fill it out, because most of these things would not, a person would not be able to fill it out. Just to give you one example, a part of that is going to be about what are the data sources you need for this and what are the systems that you need. So then you would look at and say, how is data generated and sensed, and who would be using the data and so forth. So there are questions like that for every layer. In this case, it's layer 1, the data sensing layer. And you can see that, again, we're asking about documentation. How is this process, how is it documented? And it says we have little documentation, or we have well-documented format annotation. There are 4 different levels of, how much you know about the data you need. And, oops, sorry. And sorry, it's my computer. And here is how you describe the current data collection or generation capabilities. I'm not sure. Manual and it's not adequate. Automatic and it's not adequate. A manual, it's adequate, and automatic, and it's because it doesn't, just because something is collected by hand doesn't mean that it's inadequate. So these are sort of really questions, details on the technology side. So when we look at these, different assessments, we can see that we really have developed an assessment tool for these 3 aspects: the people, process, and technology. And they're in place, and it's just a matter of applying them, piloting them, improving them, and so forth. That would give us then really, I know this is a complicated draft, but we've seen these 7 categories on the left on that first model. This is the second model for the business process, and this is on the technology side. This is not impossible to do. It's just that it's not currently being done. That's like, 70% of the initiatives are not successful. So, and whenever we change one thing, if we change just technology, it's going to impact people. And if we change organization, it will impact the choices made about processes and so forth. So one way to look at it is to construct what we could think of as a 360-degree view of these maturity aspects of an organization. And it provides us a foundation to look at, to use a systems thinking approach. So what does this mean, systems thinking? It means that we focus on the interactions between these things. So let's say that you were asked, but the general manager says, I want a good decision support system. So that's what you were asked to do. And currently it's not there, and it's not very mature. But then if you look here and you say, well, the business process that we want to support is not really well documented, and this business process is complex, so the impact of failure is significant. The data that is required to execute this process effectively is not actually being collected. The employee engagement is low, and the team and collaboration is at low level of maturity. It would probably give us pause and say, and we're typically, organizations are not doing this today. They just kind of launch into a technology improvement initiative. But
Hey,
I think,
Cello,
yes, sorry.
Brian has his hand up as well.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Guy. I cannot see the hands up, so thank you, Brian.
If I have my hand up, it's a mistake, actually.
I have my hand up. This Duncan.
Oh, Duncan. Okay.
Yeah.
And Deb has hers up too. So we have a couple questions.
Yeah. The question I had, Chair, was more to do with the technology changes so fast. And when you go through the process, if the process is so complicated, by the time you're done with it, the technology has changed. And also the way people define technology, they might say they have technology, but has reached its useful life, where you have technology that you've been using for the last 10 years. So when you ask about the question of technology, we have systems like these old IBM systems, the systems that have been there for 10 years. But the question of technology and people knowing about it, they might answer yes. But in reality, that technology, if you don't do every few years evaluation, it might not be providing the value that you're looking for. And I was just wondering how you accommodate the changes in technology when somebody is asking this question about technology, because people might think they have technology, but actually they might be using technology that is costing the organization money because they have refused to move into the new technologies, or to look into the new technologies that are there to replace whatever they have.
Yes. A couple of points. It was, I think, if I miss any aspect of your question, please let me know. I think your first point was that technology changes fairly quickly today. And it's absolutely true. In a place that I used to work, we had some pumps that have been around for 40 years or 50 years, and they're still working quite well. But the newer technology that we are obtaining and likely to keep obtaining, it may not, especially process control systems. The average life of a process control system is maybe 15 years. I'm not making this up. It's a result of a survey that I did of a number of utilities to come up with that, and then they have to replace it. My most recent control system project had to do with a facility called Diamond Valley Lake, which there's a lake at the higher elevation, and there's this facility below that serves as a power generation, 25 megawatt power generation facility when you drop the water down from the lake. But you can use the same turbines to pump the water back into the lake for storage. So it was a 20-year-old, not 18-year-old system. But the only way to get into the details of the system was through a PC that was running Windows 2000. So although there's nothing wrong with the turbines, some components of our technology that rely on computers and software and stuff like that can lose their effectiveness very quickly. That facility was in a place where they had to buy parts on eBay because they couldn't even find parts. And so it is true that the technology changes very quickly, and it seems like it will change even more quickly in the when it becomes more automation and stuff like that. Am I answer your question? Yes, Scott.
I was just going to add, Duncan, that what Cello was talking about in terms of the, all of this is that sometimes the focus has been on a particular technology solution, but what this really gets at is what are the data collection requirements, what are the analytical requirements, what are the data management requirements, and for example, so it has a more complete organization to it. So you're not just dealing with what latest bell and whistle should we acquire? What are your business needs that underlie all this?
So I think, Duncan, did that answer your first question about the changes in technology?
Yes.
Okay, so I think the second question is, you see, what I think is very common, and I would ask people who are on the call today to let me know if they see this in their organizations. If that is that, let's say that the second layer, the data management, data is often hard to get to. And it makes a difference who is the quote owner of the data. And we may, when it comes to data management, let's say we have a pump. That pump hopefully doesn't have a different name in your engineering drawing, in your maintenance management system, CMMS, in your CIP, in your hydraulic model, or in your GIS. If it does,
it does have different names.
yeah. So
yes.
so and that means, and if you look at it, each one of these systems, each one of these computer systems has to be updated and changed, and then but the ability, if we want to support business needs that transcend a single system and use the CMMS data for things like CIP planning, then this kind of limitation, and so this data management is very, very, very important. And it also, if we look at these 4 layers, if we don't collect the data at all, we don't have anything to manage. So we cannot have sensing at a level 1 and data management at level 4. You know, and if we don't manage the data properly and it's not accessible, how can we have effective analytics? It's going to be very hard. If we don't have analytics tools, how can we provide decision support? So that's why it's kind of, you know, in that hierarchical level, because it's all, even within the technology part, it's all kind of related. And the system thinking about you know, interactions between these different things. Like I mentioned 6 things here that are all really, you know, really, it's about the integration and interaction.
Deb has her hand up as well.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks.
Thank you. Just real quick, and this might be more directed towards Scott, but I'm hearing it from Cello. Really, when we look at this from the perspective of where Lisa's coming from, when she's talking about she wants to have an asset management system, she's thinking about these things, correct?
Yes.
That's where
Sure.
she's coming from. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Cello's point about, you know, those red circles is really important, and that's maybe a theme of this presentation that he's giving, is that they're all related. You know, that you know, implicitly you're going to be doing it if you're not doing it more consciously. That there are relationships across 3-6 around the circle.
Yeah, even if you look at just business processes, like I mentioned before, if it's complex and impact is significant and it's not well documented, we're kind of asking for trouble. But let me just show, because I want to have some time for discussion. This is from our change management team. When we looked at change management, which is how do we make change effectively, taking all these interactions into consideration. We asked 2 questions of our change management group. On major project, what typically gets most attention? And you can see, I know that the type is a little small, but this is acquisition/implementation of technology gets most attention, process improvements, workforce and organizational culture. Then we asked questions, what are the most likely causes of problems? Workforce and culture, process, and technology. So this was not something that Scott or I made up. This is what the folks from you know, change management are telling us. So what we're currently doing, and we're just starting it, we're really looking at a similar model because there are different aspects of change management, this circle around. And, leadership and vision, communication with stakeholders, change process, because change management is a process, skills and capability, and executing change. And below is just an example of statements, this communication with stakeholders, the second layer, that we have started with some questions, and then here there are comments from the core team members. So we're working on that. And we're just working on that maturity assessment for change management. Sometimes they call it, look at it in a reverse way. They say change readiness, how ready you are for change. So these types of interactions between our change management capabilities and these other aspects, people, process, and technology, are the key aligning this to have effective change process. So that's what the project is all about. It's about a positive change, and these are different components of change. So I'll stop now and be quiet and listen to others and the questions.
So you can raise your hand. I'm going to make one comment, which is that what we have are these 6 teams that are, this team is off doing this, and this team is dealing with that, and on people, process, and technology and change. And really the point here is that in order to be most successful, it's important to deal with all of those different aspects and to try to integrate them. Now, not everybody is going to have an entry point that deals with all of it all together, all at the same time, but it's just to recognize that those are aspects that really can be covered. Another point is that, Cello talked about, particularly on technology, that a quote survey doesn't really cut it very well. Some participants are finding that for work process or for organizational culture and workforce and change management, that a workshop type of setting is an appropriate way also, rather than just to send out a survey. So it's kind of up to each individual utility to decide best ways to cover all these different aspects and how best to do it. Comments, questions, people should, that was a lot of material.
Yeah, one question I had is more of the stakeholders, how you identify all the people who need to participate in these processes and keep them engaged, so that as you go through the steps that they are there, maybe whether there are strategies of identifying the stakeholders and to keep them engaged as you go through the process. Because I noticed as we went through BCE, we lost some people on the way. There were people who were very engaged at the beginning, but as we went through the process, they are not as engaged. And is a process, especially if you want to integrate the people, process, and technology component. There are different groups from different departments, and their engagement level changes over time. And I was just wondering whether you guys have strategies of keeping people engaged so that you can successfully finish whatever you started.
Duncan, you're an example, one of the best examples of basically acknowledging that those stakeholders are important. You have a training program set up that you're implementing to try to include those stakeholders and encouraging them to do it. But the change management team is a lot of where that is happening, where they're identifying a process, and one important step of that process is to identify the stakeholders, because as Cello said earlier, that a lot of that engagement by stakeholders is a key to success, and that if you don't have it, a lot of initiatives fail. Jenny is an example. I'm looking at her mug here, and she basically is kind of working with stakeholders a lot to include them in the processes that she's doing. So all of that is real key, and But again, Duncan, you're in a good example of somebody who's living that.
The other thing is what you've done very well and smart is that you didn't try to boil the ocean and apply this to, you selected a smaller piece of the CIP. And then what you did is when you were developing the business process model, you were developing those swim lanes that defined who's involved and what they do. And so you didn't have to deal with everybody in the organization. So you could select the process. You could then, when you document the process, you put the swim lanes, you identify who's involved, and you can then apply these tools to a more limited group of people. And with a specific, deliverable. Jenny has offered something in the chat line, and would you mind sharing us what you just said, Jenny?
Yes, it was just in response to Duncan's question, and that I think that active visible sponsorship is the key to stakeholder engagement throughout the process. You need it at the beginning when you identify those stakeholders, and you need it throughout to keep those stakeholders involved. And I think the other comment I have is related to this, but related to just all the information, is it's really important to define the value you're looking for at the very beginning. So Chilla, when you gave the example of your manager says, we'd like to improve our decision-making model, that's very vague. So I think getting clear on what's the goal, what are the pain points in your organization and the current decision-making model. And yes, you could do all that maturity and assessment, but if you're not clear on what you're trying to achieve, you want to lower your costs, you want to mitigate risk, you need to know that. And then that's where your active sponsorship can reiterate that this is the value of this process. This is why you need to stay engaged. This is why this is going to better our organization. That clear goal is really key to understanding how much you can bite down and scope down to what you need to work on.
Yeah, very good comment. Yeah.
Yep, thanks.
Dan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of piggyback on what Jenny said there, because I've just been kind of thinking about, applying this like tools and some of these things, like how can I use this with what I'm working on. And Jenny, you hit on something I was really thinking about. Like, I'll just say, for example, later today, I've got a meeting. Our director came talk to me and wanted me to partner up with one of our HR people about brainstorming some ideas for employee development. Well, like you said, I mean, that's like, I was like, wow, that could go a lot of different ways. But as I was looking at this, I was like, your very first point, even before you do the maturity assessment, is define the scope of improvement. And they ask the question, what is the scope of the improvement? And so that's going to be the focus of our conversation today, is to say, well, let's brainstorm some ideas about what the scope of this really is. And then, with that, I might suggest, because it's Parajat I'm meeting with, I know she's working on the people side. I might suggest to her, like, maybe we want to use this assessment tool as a way to kind of help focus our thinking in terms of what we want to tackle once we get it defined, what we're trying to tackle. Because then the other piece of this that I was thinking about that this tool, and correct me if I'm kind of wrong here, is it seems like this is really kind of helping to guide and balance the reality of strategy and tactics. I'll just say our organization, we tend to focus on lots of tactical stuff, like do this, do that. Oh, here's a great idea, go do it. And we may not be aligned with our strategy, or maybe not aligned with what's going to provide the highest value. And this tool seems like it maybe helps to say, assess your tactics and formulate your tactics around where you're going to get the most value. So I'll just stop there and say, ask the question, am I on the right track? On this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And you're right. First we have to define, maybe all we want to do is some training, and then we would go up here. But if we want to improve processes or technology and performance, part of the developing process documentation is defining the metrics and the KPIs. So I think people very often just skip to buying shiny, objects, and then there are different people and process issues that come into play. And one thing that I wanted to mention before we leave, I know we're getting close, is we had a really good workshop in 2019 before pandemic in Oregon at Clean Water Services. And we're planning such a workshop for the spring of this year in May, and Kansas City is going to host it. So that will be an opportunity for us to get together and in-person meeting and discuss all of these things. So yes, some of these things look kind of maybe too hairy and daunting, but it's really not. It's really doable, and also it looks weird because people are currently not doing it in our industry, in our sector. But there's nothing magical about this, and I think as we move with some pilot implementations and these things show value, it'll bring value to the utilities, fairly quickly.
Well, very good. Well, yeah, we got about 2 minutes left, and I wanted to hit real quick that we're still kind of in this January to May timeframe, and as Cello mentioned, now we actually are planning also an in-person workshop in May, which I think is great timing because that's kind of the shift for our teams from May to July. We'll start focusing on documenting in some case studies where we're at with our particular improvement initiatives and what we've accomplished and maybe even where we're going at that stage. So that's kind of the overall schedule. And then next week, I've invited Brian and his team from San Francisco to present on kind of the current state of their CIP program, maybe where some of their challenges and pain points are for our group to think about, look at, provide some feedback, and maybe also wrap up with where you guys, Brian, are seeing opportunities for, leveraging this program.
I tell you, a lot of resonance with our with the discussion today, but one of the challenges I have is there's an awful lot of what we talked today that's really outside of our sphere of influence as far as efficiencies and purchasing, for example, even the technology piece. There are parts of the organization that control the technology piece that we just we're fighting all the time. It's anyways. We'll go through our process, and hey, I'm love to get feedback from you guys.
Yeah. Okay. Good. And then 2 weeks, or not 2 weeks, then 2 meetings out. Duncan, we've got you on the calendar to provide an update on kind of how things are going with your implementation. And I think you've got some training you're focused on here in early March.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll be interested to hear how that goes, and also again can provide maybe some input as you're moving forward.
Sure.
All right. Wow. 10:30, and wow, Cello gave us a lot to think about. So.
And next fall, we have San Francisco next meeting. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So I thank everybody. I know that it was a little bit, much to digest, but we will work on